Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is Erin DeSandro, Philanthropic Relations Associate at GuideStar. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Good Practices in Foundation Operations webinar. We're excited to have you join us today to talk about some of the exciting insights offered by CEP, GEO, and GuideStar. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. If you've joined the presentation listening with your computer speaker system and you would like to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in info will be displayed. We will be recording today's presentation and the recording and slides will be emailed to you after the event. Our presenters are happy to address your questions, so please don't hesitate to ask a question, offer a comment, or a suggestion during the presentation using the question box or our Twitter hashtag, #GoodPractices. With that, I will pass this over to our speakers who will introduce themselves and their organizations.
Great, thank you, Erin. This is Jacob Harrell, President and CEO of GuideStar. Really glad to have you all joining us today. We've got almost 200 people. We expect probably another 100 or so more. A great turnout of folks predominantly coming directly from the foundation community. And we've got a couple of great colleagues from the Center for Effective Philanthropy and Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And, you know, we shouldn't play favorites, but these are two of my favorite fellow infrastructure organizations. And so really glad to have Austin Long and Emily Wexler here. I'll have them briefly introduce themselves and then we'll move right on to the content. So Austin?
Hi everyone, this is Austin. In my role at CEP, I lead relationships with funders through our grantee, donor, and staff perception reports, and also through a range of our customized advisory work and workshops and training events.
Great, hi
Great.
everyone.
And Emily?
Oh, yeah, hi. This is Emily Wexler, and I'm a senior manager on GEO's program team. In my role, I help design and lead GEO's peer learning opportunities, which offer grant makers an opportunity to take a deeper dive on specific challenges, practices, or interests related to effective grant-making practice.
Terrific. Thank you both. Looking forward to hearing each of your presentations soon. So briefly, here is the agenda for the webinar today. I'll offer brief opening comments, go over the 4 key concepts that we outlined in our Good Practices webinar or white paper. And then each of our 3 organizations will share a bit about how our work helps to address some of these opportunities and these challenges. And then we'll move on to Q&A. I will say in terms of questions, feel free to ask questions either through the hashtag Good Practices on Twitter or through the questions box. And we will address the bulk of them at the end, but if there are some that are coming up to you during, please share them and we may take a break to address some questions and do our best to stay as open as possible to your input. So just to frame, just to remind us of what this is all about, that in an era of climate change, of war, of racial struggle, we as a society face extraordinary problems that nonprofits and foundations are working to challenge. People are standing up for what they believe in and reaching out a hand to help their communities, and that's the work that we do. We can sometimes lose a connection to that when we talk about abstract concepts around how we run our organizations, but it really matters. It really matters that we be as effective as possible in our work, because ultimately there are people on the other end of this equation. So let's always, even when we are addressing what can seem to be somewhat abstract concepts, let's always remember why we do this work. So before I go into the 4 key findings of our white paper, let me just highlight 2 words in the title. So Guide to Good Practices for Foundation Operations. The first word I want to highlight is good. We intentionally did not call them best practices because the field is constantly learning and evolving. We're constantly trying to get better. And given the immense diversity of philanthropy and of the nonprofit sector, it's very hard to define one perfect approach that's going to be universally applicable. But what we have here are practices that we believe there is general consensus in the field make us better. These are good practices. These are a baseline for us as we do our very best to address the problems and opportunities that we face. The other word I want to focus on is operations. I used to work at the Hewlett Foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation building in Menlo Park, California had 2 floors, 2 levels. And the programmatic staff was on the 2nd floor, and the operations staff was on the 1st floor. Whether that was HR, grants management, IT, finance, investments, et cetera. And so the building itself reflected this division that we have in philanthropy between the programmatic side, the staff who are making decisions about where the money goes, and then those who are really executing. What I want to say, though, is that what really matters is the staircase between those 2 floors, and the ability of foundation staff to see the connections between foundation operations and foundation programmatic results. And so I say that to say that I think everything here is relevant for foundation program staff in addition to operational staff. And I think it is responsive to the needs of foundation programs. And so I hope that this is a conversation that can take place on that stairway between the 2 floors, and that connection can help us all be better. So the first finding, or the first category where we in our white paper laid out a series of resources, was around transparency, and that those foundations that share more information with the world are more likely to have credibility, to build trust, to have greater efficiency across the field, stronger relationships, et cetera. Now, there are exceptions. There are reasons why on a particular topic a foundation may not choose to be transparent, and that's just fine. But what we argue is that the default should be transparency. Our assumption should be that we're going to share information because we're trying to make a better world. And then there may be times where we choose not to share information for whatever reason. The issue we're working on is very controversial. There are legal dynamics. There could be a lot of reasons not to be transparent. But we as a field, I believe, need to shift from a default of opacity, not sharing, to a default of transparency. And that ultimately, as we do that, we can all be better. The second is around the tension between rigor and respect. In the foundation community, there's a great and I think entirely justified desire to be as rigorous as possible in our thinking, in our decision making. The challenge is that sometimes is in tension with respect for grantees and applicants' time. And for example, thinking about the fact that foundation proposals tend to ratchet up the number of questions they ask. A new generation of staff will come in with additional questions, they'll add them, but they won't actually take away the old questions, which no one pays attention to anymore. And so what had been a series of decisions to try and build rigor and seriousness on the part of a foundation ends up turning into something that's actually not respectful to applicants and grantees. And so our challenge as a field is to be as thoughtful as possible about how we balance rigor and respect. And put another way, it's about balancing rigor and efficiency. I believe that if we are smart as a field in terms of how we share information, how we use each other's data frameworks, et cetera, that we can actually be even more rigorous while still being efficient and respectful. And we have here on the slide a quote that was up in the office of my boss at the Hewlett Foundation, Paul Brest. With money in your pocket, you're wise and handsome, and you sing well too. And every time I would go into a meeting, I would look at that sign and try and remember that the inherent power dynamics that exist between providers and users of capital can lead to a distorted sense of oneself on the foundation side. And the great foundation staff that I know are very cognizant of that, and they do their best to remember that sometimes people are laughing at your jokes because you're sitting on a multi-billion-dollar endowment. Now, sometimes they're laughing at your jokes because you're actually funny, but it is very important, I think, to be explicit about the emotional dynamic that exists between grantees and foundations, and to keep that in mind as we think about this balance between rigor and respect. The third piece is around responsiveness to one's constituents. There's an interesting question, I think, that foundations face, which is, well, exactly who are our constituents? From a legal standpoint, it is essentially the board of directors. From a day-to-day standpoint, it's most importantly one's grantees. But there are other groups that really matter, whether that is your staff as a constituency of an institution, and how do you engage with them and learn from them to help your work be better. And then, God forbid, we try to provide a voice to those people that we're trying to help, to the end beneficiaries of our grant making. And so a critical dynamic and a very challenging one for foundations is to build feedback loops with appropriate constituencies to ensure accountability, but also to enable learning. And then fourthly is that the fundamental moral and strategic challenge and opportunity that foundations face around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know, the data shows quite clearly that at the leadership level, in particular at the board level, the leadership of foundations do not reflect the diversity of America or the world. They reflect a history of where capital has accumulated, in which parts of society. And there are many, many efforts to address this, to try and have philanthropy better reflect America and the world. And we're making some progress, but we still have a long way to go. And it's become clear to me, and I believe to many in the field, that we need another level of intentionality and openness around diversity, equity, and inclusion to ensure that we are actually living the promise of American democracy. Great. So we're going to go on to a couple of polls quickly. Let me also just remind you all, we welcome questions, and that can either be through the question box or through the Twitter hashtag, hashtag good practices. But now we're going to ask two poll questions, and they are mirror images of each other. They're very simple. We just want to ask you all, and I'm very curious to see what you have to say. Of the four concepts that I just laid out, transparency, respectfulness, responsiveness to grantees and other constituents as well, and incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, which one of these is the foundation community doing the best job of right now? The second question will be the reverse of that, which is which one do we need to work on the most? But right now, as we launch the poll, the question is simply, which one are we doing the best job on as a field? You have to pick one. You can't say we're doing a terrible job on all four. We're making progress in every case, I believe. All right, the numbers are coming in. Interesting. All right, most of you have voted. Give it just a little bit longer. All right, let's show the results. All right, so it looks like 27% of you believe we're doing the best work around transparency. 31% around this balance between rigor and respectfulness with grantees. And then 33% around responsiveness to grantees and constituents. And then much lower level, 9%, around DEI. So there's essentially a three-way tie given the size of our sample here, which is really interesting to see. So some of you see real progress in all three of those, but it's also quite clear that there's a near consensus among this group of experts that we have a ways to go on DEI. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next question. So let's move on to the next question. All right, so the next question is, again, the reverse of the first one. Which one do we need to do the most work on? I have a pretty strong hunch where we're going to land on this, judging by the last one. All right, we will close the poll. So, big surprise, 68% of you believe that the foundation community has the most work to do around incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into the work of foundations. Transparency second at 18%, followed by responsiveness to grantees and other constituents at 10%, and then just 4% around respectfulness to grantees. So there's a pretty clear message coming out of this data, which is the room we have to grow around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's really interesting result there. Thank you, everyone, for participating on that. So let's move on. I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about GuideStar and how we see our work connecting to foundation operations around these four concepts, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues. So the metaphor that we use when talking about GuideStar's work is a supply chain, that essentially information flows from the left-hand side of this slide to the right-hand side. And that flow of information is critical to good decision-making by a number of different stakeholders in the social sector. So, and nonprofits are key to this as the most important source of, just a second. All right, we were just switching back among our various views, but I think we're in good shape now, right? All right, well, we seem to be having a bit of technical problems. It's gotten stuck. So I'm gonna keep talking and let my colleagues figure out a magical solution. That's still what she's saying. Okay. What if we close it? For some reason, GoToWebinar is not allowing us to advance beyond the polls back to the PowerPoint presentation. So hopefully we'll have that fixed in just a second. So when I think about GuideStar's role in the broader social sector, it began with a focus on individual donors. But we've come to understand over the last 2 decades that our most important users are professionals, people whose job it is to make the world better. And in particular, we would note 2 groups. One are the executives of nonprofits, and then the other are executives at foundations. And we think all of them can connect to these 4 concepts. I think transparency is relatively obvious how transparency connects to the work of GuideStar. We have 8 million people using our data every year to hopefully learn something about the nonprofit sector. in terms of the balance between rigor and respect, I think there's a really interesting opportunity that we have as a field to begin in a new way to think about how information moves between applicants and foundations. You know, in the world of college admissions, we have a common application protocol that has saved millions of hours of work on the part of college applicants. And we believe there's an opportunity for something similar in philanthropy. It may not be a, my colleagues are working on our technical problem here. Just a moment. All right, it looks like we've solved the problem. You know, it's always funny when just about any time a technology-oriented organization gives a presentation, there are always technical problems. You can always count on it. So back to the second piece around the balance between rigor and respect. So if we as a field can eventually figure out how to have something along the lines of a common application, we'll have the opportunity to respect nonprofits' time in a totally different way. But I also think it will offer a new opportunity for new kinds of rigor and the sharing of information in a way that could lead to new kinds of learning as well. So one example for that is what we call GuideStar for grants, which is that we have created a, sorry, my colleagues are, we have created a new tool that allows GuideStar data to auto-populate grants management software systems. Most every major foundation is using one of these software systems made by vendors such as MicroEdge, Flux, Foundant, and others. And that's the kind of thing that it's a small gesture of respect to one's applicants and grantees, that the flow of information, when automated on the back end, saves time on the part of those who are making an investment of their own resources to try to raise money. Onto responsiveness. So we've built in a number of mechanisms around this, such as, for example, including reviews through great nonprofits on GuideStar profiles. But this is one where we think there's a tremendous amount of potential for additional learning, and we've been working with colleagues through the Fund for Shared Insight and others to try to think about what new feedback loops might be able to be built on top of GuideStar's platform. And then finally, I'll just mention around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we've started to really think about how to better collect data about the demographics of nonprofit staff and boards, and more systematically share that with foundations so that this sort of information can become a part of the conversations which are happening between foundations and their applicants. And that those conversations can actually be based on data and not just on speculation. We've had about 10,000 nonprofits share that data, and there are some foundations that are starting to actually require that any applicant share data about the demographics of their staff and board with that foundation as part of the application process. And again, this is this interesting balance between rigor and respect, that if we can make that sort of a practice something that is standard practice across the field, then I think we'll have an opportunity for a totally different kind of conversation. All right, I'm going to now hand it over to Austin. We are right on time, even with our little technical glitch, and let him share just a bit more about CEP and their perspective on good practices in foundation operations.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jacob, and thanks everyone on the line for joining today as well. Just for folks who aren't familiar with CEP, we're a nonprofit that works with foundations of every type and size. through our assessments, through our advisory services, our research, as well as our programming. And really, CEP's ultimate goal is helping foundations improve their effectiveness and, as a result, their intended impact. So I'll take just the next 10 minutes or so to speak to some of the practices that Jacob described through what we know from CEP's research and assessments. And this includes the funder-grantee relationship, looking at foundation transparency, as well as the importance of seeking feedback in what we offer through CEP's assessments. So let me start with relationships, because that's really what's at the heart of many of the topics we're discussing here today. Across more than a decade of research, we've seen a tremendous amount of data to support what most of you already know. Relationships matter, and particularly relationships with grantees. Now, I'll share a little bit more about how we define relationships, why they matter, and what drives them. But let's first define relationships. And here we're really talking about two sets of questions CEP has refined over the years to measure this concept. And this includes how grantees interact with foundation staff through their perceptions of fairness, comfort approaching the foundation, and responsiveness of staff, and communications, specifically how clearly a foundation communicates about its goals and strategy, and the consistency of that communication across different resources. These areas make up the broader construct of funder-grantee relationships. So this isn't about relationships for the sake of relationships, but it's about relationships in service of impact. And our research shows that grantees' perceptions of their relationship with the foundation are strongly related to their perception of how much impact the foundation has. And I'll say that again. Our research shows that grantees' perceptions of their relationship with the foundation are strongly related to perceptions of impact. And we'll actually be publishing some new research in the next month that updates our previous work to show the strongest drivers of relationships with grantees, where the top two drivers include understanding, as well as foundation transparency. Now, given the importance of these areas, let's spend some time talking a little bit more about each. Now, understanding may sound simple enough, but we know that there are many different facets of understanding that drive relationships. This includes building a mutual understanding of what your grantees are trying to achieve and their strategy and goals, building an awareness of the challenges they face in their work, understanding grantees' fields and local communities, and particularly related to this point about diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the social, cultural, or socioeconomic factors that affect grantees' work, as well as the needs of those who the work ultimately seeks to help, their intended beneficiaries. Now, our researchers also look closely at foundation transparency through the perspective of foundation CEOs and grantees. And the good news is that overall, we see strong alignment between funders and grantees about defining what transparency even means. And we see the shared definition as being clear, open, and honest about the processes and decisions that affect grantees and other stakeholders. When we surveyed foundation CEOs, we saw that they believe their foundations were most transparent about their grant-making processes and goals and strategies, but least transparent about sharing how they assess their performance or their lessons learned. And overall, again, we see that foundation and grantee perceptions tend to align in terms of these two areas. But what was most striking to us about that last point is that we also asked foundation CEOs about the degree to which they believed being more transparent in any area would increase their effectiveness. And on the bottom right quadrant here, we see that even though foundation CEOs believe being more transparent about assessing their work or sharing what has not worked can increase their effectiveness, these are actually the areas they view their foundations as being least transparent. And these are the same areas where grantees rated their funders lowest for aspects of transparency. And that brings us up to the final point about being responsive to constituents through seeking feedback. I'll use the example of grantee feedback here, but this really applies to seeking feedback from your own staff internally, your donors if you're a community foundation, or other stakeholders or beneficiaries. And CEP helps funders seek all of this feedback through a range of assessments, including the Grantee Perception Report, which has been used to provide data and insight from more than 50,000 grantees of over 300 funders. And really, CEP's assessments were built on the value of benchmarking and comparative data. So why is comparative data so important? I know we talk about this all the time at CEP. But let's use an example from one of the questions that we ask in the Grantee Perception Report. And this question is, overall, how would you rate the foundation's impact on your organization? And let's just say that across all of your grantees, you see an average rating of a 6.0 on a 1 to 7 scale. Is this positive? Well, we think so. The rating's at the top half of the scale, and it looks great. But if we were to compare these results to those of other foundations, we'd actually find that most grantees don't tend to use the lower end of the scale. So when we look at this rating of a 6.0 in the context of other funders, and here I'm showing the full range of ratings in CEP's dataset, where the lowest rated funder is at the 0th percentile on the left, the highest rated funder is at the 100th percentile on the right, we see that a 6.0 turns out to be lower than the rating received by most funders on this survey question at just the 35th percentile. And this makes sense when we think about it in the context of philanthropy that Jacob mentioned earlier. For grantees, the experience of receiving a grant is inherently positive, and that halo effect influences their feedback and ratings of their funders. So this comparative context that CEP provides is really crucial for being able to interpret your grantee's feedback, really to know what's truly a strength or an opportunity to learn and grow. And this comparative data is about normalizing results, revealing a range of possibility, and CEP works closely with funders to interpret these results in light of their own goals, strategies, and context. So just to sum up, we know that relationships matter and that they're connected to grantee perceptions of a funder's impact. We also know that strong relationships are driven through building understanding and demonstrating transparency. Both foundation CEOs and grantees agree that funders are less transparent about how they assess their performance and share their lessons learned. And that means that funders and grantees are missing important opportunities to learn and improve together. And finally, seeking feedback from grantees, staff, or donors is important. But being able to interpret what that feedback means for a foundation really requires comparative data, particularly given the funder-grantee power dynamic. Great, thanks so much, everyone. And I think from here, I'm going to turn it over to Emily to speak to Gio's perspective.
Great, thank you.
Great,
so
thank
much,
you, Austin.
Great.
Well, Emily, take it away.
I will. Okay, so I mean, it's just so great because there are just such clear through lines between what Jacob shared, what Austin shared. So before I dive in, I just thought I'd offer a brief overview of GEO for those of you who aren't familiar with us. So GEO, which is short for Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, is a community for grant makers to find opportunities to make faster progress on the issues that they care about most. And so with conferences focused on solving of-the-moment challenges, regular opportunities for peer learning, and publications that lift up best practice and examples from peers, the GEO community is a place to find clarity on which improvements make a difference for our grantees and a place to work with other grant makers navigating on the same journey to improve in our work. And so I want to start with this idea that is really central to GEO's work, and that's this idea that our success as grant makers is inextricably linked to the strengths of our connections with the nonprofits and communities in which we work, and that very much aligns with what we've just been listening to over the last 36 minutes or so. And so this idea that if we are only as successful as the organizations, leaders, and movements that we support, then the fundamental question before us is, how do we engage in a way that enhances the work that leaders on the ground and in the field are doing? So one overriding themes throughout this really great piece by GuideStar is the role that empathy plays in our work. And as grant makers, it begins with getting out of the bleachers and getting onto the track. And so something that GEO has learned in its work with grant makers is that high empathy grant makers look at our grant making strategies, policies, processes, operations, and requirements through the eyes of grantees and others. And we always ask questions about whether our organization is doing the right thing by its grantees and applicants for support. And so this idea of by employing empathy throughout all our work, grant makers can gain an intuitive understanding of why our work is important, what it's achieving, whom it's helping, where it's falling short, and what more needs to be done. So empathy on an individual level is the ability to reach outside of ourselves and connect in a deeper way with other people, to understand their experiences, to get where they're coming from, to feel what they feel. Widespread empathy really scales that intuition from the individual to the organization. And so in philanthropic organizations that have widespread empathy, every single person, not just program officers, but the entire board and executive leadership, finance, HR, grants managers, communications, operations staff, and others, has an immediate sense of the true needs, concerns, and priorities of grantees and communities and what solutions will best meet those needs. So empathy is also a critical antidote to something that Jacob mentioned, which is power dynamics, which is an influential force within the sector. And so traditional philanthropy is entrenched in a model of hierarchy and power. Since foundations hold the money, we create formal and informal parameters within which nonprofits are forced to operate. And the perception among many nonprofit and community leaders is that grant makers are driven by our own agendas and needs rather than what's best for people and organizations working at the grassroots level. And this divide is further augmented by class and race differences between foundation leaders and community members, and the many processes, procedures, and requirements associated with foundation operations. But this isn't just an image problem. This lack of strong connections between grant makers and our grantees and communities is often a major barrier to philanthropic effectiveness as well. So while we may not be able to completely remove the inherent power imbalance between grant makers, our grantees, and the communities we serve, we can take steps to build more trusting, honest, and authentic relationships. And how we approach our organization's operations is really a powerful way to do this. And so I want to share some guiding principles to build upon the great insight that was in this GuideStar piece. And the first is that it's about making it about others and not about you or your organizations. And what we mean by this is adding a new lens to the way we view and do our work. And so it's about taking a look at our operations, strategies, policies, and processes, and even our interactions through the eyes of grantees. So this could mean working with the resources provided by Project Streamline to minimize the burden of the application and reporting process. It could also mean setting aside the philanthropic jargon that we use in our materials, on our website, and in our conversations so that we can communicate with grantees more clearly. And this next bullet on the screen is a little bit more direct. Getting out of the office is just that. It's about meeting people where they are. And so there is no substitute for talking and listening to people and learning about them and their work. So getting out in the community, attending the same events as our grantees, serving on boards, or volunteering for nonprofits can be a great way for us to go beyond some of the more traditional mechanisms for engaging. And as a parallel, bringing the outside in is also a way that the community and grantee presence can be seen, heard, and felt within our organizations. And so inviting grantees to meet with board and staff is a way to both give grant reports a face and a story for everyone involved, and it also shows how much we value their work. Additionally, hiring people with nonprofit experience is also a concrete way to bring in greater empathy and different perspective into your operations. And based on the preliminary findings from our 2017 field survey, the number of foundations hiring people with nonprofit experience continues to rise. Next is around this idea of invest in what it takes. So if we want to do this work well, building empathy and stronger relationships, it costs considerable time and resources. So especially if you want to take on those higher touch strategies for engagement, such as overhauling a burdensome reporting process, or taking the time to do more meaning making with grantees about what you both are learning from your work. And then lastly, developing empathy in and across an organization means a shift in organizational culture. And those are things that often have to come from the top, from senior leadership. But that being said, those of us who aren't in leadership positions can make the case for why this work is important, and can also lead by example to demonstrate the impact of operating with this deeper understanding of your grantees and community members. And the good news here is that investing in stronger relationships has real payoff because it has a direct influence on grant-making practice. And so as I mentioned, we do every 3 years a field survey of staffed grant-making organizations in the United States, and so we're still pulling together our preliminary findings, but I wanted to share a few of them with all of you today. And so one thing we discovered is that grant makers who invested in strengthening their relationships with grantees, nonprofits, and representatives from recipient community through seeking their advice and feedback, making a point to hire staff who have experience working in a nonprofit and had board members that represented grantees, other nonprofits, or recipient communities, were more likely to provide the types of support that nonprofits need most to thrive, such as the ones listed on the screen, which are providing multi-year grants, providing capacity building support, and conducting learning and evaluation activities. The same also goes for grant makers who are able to articulate a clear commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their mission, and we're able to back this commitment with actual behaviors and practices, such as disaggregating the data they collect so that they can target their grant-making dollars to communities that have experienced oppression or discrimination, policies and practices to support diversity at the staff and board level, and made investments in assessing and training for their staff. In this case, these funders are not only more likely to provide the 3 types of critical sustenance that you see on the screen here, but they're also more likely to provide general operating support, which gives nonprofits the resources to strengthen their organizations, respond to changes in our communities, and make real progress. And so while there's a lot to explore here, I really want to dig into this piece around learning and evaluation just a bit more. So many of the great ideas in the white paper, starting with the first one, transparency, touch on this idea of shedding light on previously opaque or unexamined areas of grantmaker operations. And so one of the benefits that Glass Pockets has identified as one of the major benefits of transparency is that it cultivates a community of shared learning and good practices among foundations. And so one example of this is how we approach evaluation in our work. And so while many grantmakers embrace the value of learning and evaluation as a path to achieving better results, some see evaluation as something that takes place independently and primarily for internal improvement, and they struggle to extend this learning to those outside their organizations in a meaningful way. But when grantmakers join their partners in the learning journey, we acquire better information, which leads to better results. And this doesn't mean simply conducting final program evaluations and sharing those out, but rather it means partnering with others to regularly assess ways to improve our work and find ways to be smarter and more effective in achieving our goals. So as a field, though, too much of our learning and evaluation is siloed, and this has just some great cross-reference to some of the data that Austin shared as well. And so some of the preliminary findings from our 2017 field survey show that grantmakers are using evaluation data they collect for primarily internal purposes, with the highest use being to report to boards. Further, less than half of grantmakers that we surveyed reported on their evaluation findings to grantees or other stakeholders, or shared their findings with other grantmaker peers. And so we have at GEO an advisory council made up of some incredible nonprofit leaders from across the country. And one thing we hear from them time and time again is that they want more insight in where do the reports that they submit to their funders go? What are grantmakers learning that might help them strengthen their work? And this makes complete sense because evaluation enhances grantmaker and grantee performance when information is used to inform real-time improvements to strategy and practice. And so learning and evaluation, much like many foundation operations, doesn't have to live within the walls of our own organization. And so as reflected in the quote on the screen here, we are part of an ecosystem. And so by shifting towards coming together with others, our processes not only improve, but our outcomes do as well. And so another area of operations that the GuideStar piece explores is this critical touch point in our relationship with current and prospective grantees, which is our due diligence process. And so at its essence, due diligence is the process that helps grantmakers get to know grant seekers. Typically, it's seen strictly as a means to ensure an organization's financial and legal compliance. However, when it's done well, due diligence has the potential to provide insight into critical attributes as the role of the organization's board, the position the nonprofit holds in the field and community, and the level of alignment between our own mission and the goals of the grant seeker. And so depending on the intent that informs the design of the due diligence process, it can also be the springboard to a stronger relationship between a grant maker and an agent of change in your community. And it's also an opportunity to pause and ask, how as we as grant makers can be more effective partners in the communities and on the issues with which we work. And so taking the time to invest in a carefully considered and thoughtfully designed due diligence process can achieve a number of benefits, several of which are listed on the screen. So this added confidence, due diligence allows us to make funding decisions based on a deeper understanding of how each grant-seeking organization operates and its larger strategies. There's this piece around alignment, so this knowledge provides us with an understanding of a grant seeker's planned activities and goals and how they apply to our grant-making strategy. And then transparency, that word keeps coming up. It is a two-way street, and providing us due diligence provides us with a window into the grant seeker's capacity to achieve its goals, as well as giving the grant seeker an understanding of our funding interests and how grant-making decisions are made. Better relationships with grantees. And so a thoughtful approach to due diligence can lay the groundwork for a stronger relationship with grant seekers and grantees. And then lastly, it offers better insight into the issues facing nonprofits and the communities they serve. And in the course of due diligence work, we learn more about what is really happening on the ground with the issues and the communities that we care about. So I just want to wrap up with just a few rules of thumb to guide the due diligence process. So the first is just communicate at every turn with every grant seeker. So this means explaining the due diligence process, its purpose, the steps, and associated expectations to all grant seekers prior to its start. This also includes transparency about our financial and time constraints and following up with grant seekers with the results of the process in a timely manner. The second is that remember that due diligence is truly the first step in a long-term relationship. So by taking the time to help the grant seeker see that we have a strong sense of the issues their organization is working on and the challenges they're facing, and respecting and learning from the expertise of their staff and leadership, we open the door to a more reciprocal and authentic relationship. And lastly, and this circling back to this piece around empathy, is imagine each step through the grant seeker's eyes. So thinking about how every step of the due diligence process can help, hinder, and impact grant seekers will truly inject this sense of empathy into the due diligence process that can benefit grant makers and grant seekers alike. So with that, I will conclude and turn it back to Jacob.
Terrific. Thank you, Emily. And I just want to make an observation here how wonderfully Austin's and Emily's presentations complement each other. They make me think of the rigor with respect concept in the white paper, and that Austin's presentation offered this quantitative, fact-based nuance. Emily's had this emotional nuance, and that's exactly what grant makers need to bring to their relationships and to their work. And so that's our challenge as a field. Let me share. So we've got a couple comments that I will share, and then a question. So one comment that was really interesting came from Mary Olson. And she said, I feel that constituents should be primary, staff second, and board members third. So essentially, she's arguing for a hierarchy among different stakeholder groups. She continues, board members are there to provide guidance and keep the foundation on track with the work to be accomplished. Therefore, what keeps them happy should be last considered. I'm sure a lot of board members would be unhappy to hear that, but it is an important reminder of our need to have a hierarchy when we think about our constituents, and that the end beneficiary is ultimately the reason why we exist. Another comment from Twitter from Simone Peraza, he just notes that there's room to grow in philanthropy on racial equity, and that we need to see more representation on foundation boards and leadership by people of color. And this is an important detail here, which is when we speak about diversity, there are many different axes of diversity: race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, age, economic position. But I think we also have to have conversations about, are there some of these where the need is even more urgent? Simone argues here for race as perhaps the most urgent, and I would be inclined to agree. Others might have a different perspective. But this is exactly why it's so important to have these conversations and begin to raise up those places where it's most important for a given organization to wrestle with these questions. One question we had from Helena O'Donoghue was, and I'll give this to Austin, the question is, how should grantees access comparative data?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll say for foundations, the comparative data really comes through CEP's assessments through our grantee, donor, and staff perception reports, and the comparative data for each of those pieces. And that's what CEP really focuses on, is the funder perspective in terms of supporting comparative data from all of those different stakeholder groups. And we also do some comparative benchmarking across stakeholder perceptions as well.
Great, thank you, Austin.
Sure.
So here's a question I have for both of you, which is, how do you see foundations responding when they learn that they haven't been doing a good job?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm happy to take that. This is Austin. I think that's really probably the biggest part of what I do in my role, is working with foundations. And once folks see this feedback, whether it's positive, negative, bad, or good, we try and really frame it as a learning tool. Whether we're looking at internal staff culture and engagement, or perspective from grantees or other folks. And I think that framing about thinking about it as a learning tool, that this isn't about just getting high ratings or high marks, or oh no, we're towards the bottom of your data set. Well, I think that it really all comes down to interpreting that in light of each foundation's unique goals and strategies, and thinking about it as kind of a spectrum where we want to be able to look at what grantees feel may be working well for certain foundations, and where they can learn and improve. And we know that foundation leadership, making that feedback a priority, including staff in the process of improving, setting just really a few specific targets and priorities instead of trying to do everything at once. Those are the kinds of responses that we know tend to make a difference and help foundations improve and actually act on feedback from all of those different groups and constituencies.
Great, thank you. Emily, any comments on this?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would just add there is that I think one of the things that GEO has been learning through its field survey is that this question around strengthening relationships with grantees and communities is really proving to be sort of a keystone behavior and action within the sense that it correlates with a series of other sort of mutually reinforcing positive behaviors. And so I think when grant makers are sort of at a moment of introspection and understanding how they can be more effective in being of service to the communities in which they work, the relationship and starting with the relationship is oftentimes really kind of this linchpin moment. And so some of the data that I shared earlier shows that it really correlates this emphasis on community connectedness and understanding kind of the work that's happening on the ground and the needs of the community translates into other grantmaker practices that are really critical to nonprofit success. And so in terms of thinking about a place to start when feedback is received, is we often see grantmakers looking to the community to understand what to do next.
Great, thank you. So we just have about 5 minutes left, and we've got some final logistical details to finish up. So I'm going to, in just a second, invite Austin and Emily to offer their final thoughts. And my final thought will just be to reiterate these 4 concepts: to be transparent to the public, to be rigorous while remaining respectful of your applicants and grantees, to be responsive to your constituents, and to be proactive about diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are good practices. These are a baseline for foundation operations, and they offer, I believe, the potential of a future of a nonprofit sector and a philanthropic community that's really capable of tackling the great challenges of our time. But these day-to-day decisions that we make about the operational side of grant making have profound emotional and strategic consequences. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to chat with you all today. And let me just invite first Emily and then Austin to share a final thought or two.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll keep it really brief, but just to say that, you know, this conversation related to is about operations. And so while I believe that there is no substitute for getting out into the field and connecting with communities and grantees to better understand how our organizations can be better in service to the issues and the work that we're trying to do in the field, and that does not solely belong in the purview of program staff, and that very much can live in the world of operations and very much should live in the world of operations as much as staff who have an aspect of their role as going out in the field. So just to say that operations is a profoundly powerful place to really start to think about how you connect and align with community needs.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily, Jacob. I'll just add that, I think what has struck us at CEP, and even for me, just listening to folks here, all of these areas are so highly related. I think that's what we find, across our research, but just in our experience working with foundations, that really, if we start with relationships, we see that transparency and understanding and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and seeking constituent feedback, all of these pieces are so interconnected. And I think that reflects the challenging work that foundations do. So that's not necessarily a recommendation, but I think that I think the recommendation would be for folks to really think about these things, together as a comprehensive part of the work that you're doing, rather than in silos.
Great, thank you, Austin. And I'm going to actually throw in one more thing. We just got a comment, which is also a question, which I'm not even going to answer. We don't have time for it, but I'm just going to read it because I think it's a nice capstone here. This is a great discussion. I strongly believe that better data, increased transparency, rigor, responsiveness, and inclusion. However, isn't the real crux of the issue the decision-making on how and where funding is awarded? I would like to see at some point how micro steps toward democratizing decision-making could be achieved. Any thoughts on this concept for foundations to embrace? So there's a radical thought to close with, the democratization of foundation decision-making. And I do think that would be a conversation to have in the stairway between the two floors of the foundation, at this intersection between foundation programmatic decisions and foundation operations. So my thanks to Emily and Austin for their great contribution today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And I'll hand it back to Erin for final logistical details.
Great. Thank you, Jacob, Emily, and Austin. So it looks like we are at time right now, and we're going to go ahead and conclude the webinar. Just as a reminder, the slides recording and a link to download the free white paper will be provided in the next day or two. Thank you again so much for joining us today and for all you do to support the nonprofit sector.